first one, why is it crucial to choose the right block of land? Jane?
Because every block of land has different rules, so it's going to be covered by, it's going to be in a certain zoning under a planning scheme, and it might have some other overlays and things like that. So, for example, to do a strata title, I'm a bit of a fan of strata title, I think it's cool, but it's got this kind of bit of a stigma attached to it or something. But that is easier, Adam, in a more serviced area, maybe, then it depends on the zoning. So basically, it's really important to do the proper due diligence over any block of land that you're considering, and really understanding what it's zoned, what its overlays are, what's permitted under the planning scheme, and what is discretionary under the planning scheme. And if you understand that, then you can know, well, what are the possibilities for this block of land. But I think one of the key things for any kind of land sharing, co-housing is finding the right block of land. Yeah.
So stratas, they're much more flexible. Where they are possible, it's much more flexible than, say, a subdivision. So there's that advantage. I suppose the point I try to reiterate is, it's a strata, which is at the end of the process. It has to be permissible, i.e. something which could be approved under the planning scheme right at the start of the process. So you're not going to, and it needs to be consistent. What you get planning approval needs to be consistent with what you build, what you get building approval for, and then what you try to get a stratum plan created over, because councils do check that continuity. So to sort of respond to what you were saying, Jane, that it's easier in a serviced area, so an urban serviced area, which is most likely going to be within a residential zone, it's possible in that kind of area because it's possible under the planning scheme. So you really need to get the planning right at the start.
And how does the ownership differ between a subdivision and strata?
The main difference between strata and subdivision is a strata has to have common property, and a strata must have a body corporate. Like every strata has a body corporate, whether it's active or not.
And what is a body corporate?
It's essentially the owners getting together and deciding how the common property will be governed.
Okay. Next question is this is an Adam question, is only one ancillary or secondary dwelling / granny flat
Cracking question.
allowed per title?
Cracking.
And why?
So we spoke before, Amanda.
Or any ways around this, yeah.
We spoke before about there being grey areas, and that there may be a difference between what you can perhaps take a hardline stance on and engage a lawyer and ultimately win at the tribunal and get what you want approved via that sort of path. Or there's the more, I suppose, cooperative, collaborative approach with council of ensuring that the person who's ultimately assessing your application is comfortable with what you're proposing, because ultimately the council planner has to potentially defend that decision at the tribunal. Like I fairly regularly have to toddle off to the tribunal and be cross-examined by lawyers, so we are conscious of that when we're making a decision. So what was the question? So
can you have two ancillary dwellings or not?
It's a cracking question, because I think it will certainly be argued that you can. It does talk about a secondary dwelling, so that the singular, but that's nothing to say that...
So it's discretionary?
It's open to interpretation.
Okay, so what should someone wanting to put a second ancillary dwelling onto or under their house? Because they in fact can be detached, they can be under the house, they need to have a separate entry, but these are some of the options for ancillary, aren't they?
Yeah, as I said before, the form of the building doesn't really matter from a planning perspective, it's about how it's used. Some of the facilities within the building do have a bearing upon how it's classified. My advice to anyone considering trying to get approval for a secondary dwelling would be talk to council first, see what their reaction is. If they're pretty hard no, and I suspect that probably would be the case. It's certainly not...
for a secondary.
Yeah, so secondary. But I don't think it is the intent of that allowance. It's kind of a limited allowance for a second limited dwelling. That is, I think, the intent. That said, though, given how that definition is worded, you could try and argue that it is permissible to have more than one ancillary dwelling. And again, it may depend upon how hard you wish to push that. If you go to council with that idea, they say no, it's still then open to you to seek legal advice and to then try and push that and perhaps provide some legal advice to council saying, yes, it is possible, and then see if that changes council's position. Council should then at least seek their own advice in that situation. I wouldn't bet on it, though, to be honest. I wouldn't be, you know...
Definitely a grey area, Adam.
Yeah, and that is planning.
Another question for you. Why do tiny houses, self-sustaining, off-grid, portable, where do they fit into the current future planning scheme, land sharing?
Well, again, I just come back to planning isn't that concerned with the form of the building or even really the size. If it has all the facilities which constitute a dwelling, so kitchen, bathroom, laundry, bedroom, etc., it's considered a dwelling, regardless of whether it's a tiny house or a huge house or whatever.
What if it's a tiny house on wheels, though? Yeah.
So the difference with a caravan is whether it's still a road registerable vehicle. And there's been some tribunal decisions around that. So that's the line. So if you take the wheels off a caravan, it stops being road registerable and becomes a building or structure. But if you leave the wheels on and you keep it registered or even registerable, then it's still not a building. Yeah.
I think how I would say it is if you've got a little house on a trailer and it's registered as a vehicle, it doesn't come under building regulations. Does that help?
What if it's an amount? Like if you pick up, take one of those tilt tray, like a domino, is that still?
That would then come into the services of it. If you need connection to wastewater or a sewerage or on-site wastewater, then that would push it into building stuff, because a caravan is fully self-contained with its own waste and everything. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Okay, Jane, given that the price of land is young buyers' stumbling block, that accessibility question, is there a way of financing houses that are built on rented land, i.e. rent the land, own the house? For example, community land trusts.
It quite possibly would be possible. But I can't say a definite yes, no or anything else because I don't know the answer, sorry.
Yeah, in a way, I'm just thinking your daughter's situation is not dissimilar in a way, isn't it? Because they own the house but not the land at all.
Yeah, they own the house but not the land, yeah.
I think, so what you're saying is you rent the land and build a house. The thing is that when you're going to get the approvals to build that house, the owner of the land of which it is being built on, and whoever owns the title of which the building is being built on, is really going to be the one that's the applicant. So you would I would suggest in that scenario you need to have a robust agreement with the owner of the land to be able to do that. I don't see why it's not possible, but whoever's name is on the title of the land is the one that's responsible for the application of the building.
And I'd bear in mind too that if you're renting the land, what happens if the landowner changes their mind or their circumstances change? It's nothing malicious usually, it's just people's circumstances change and they have to review the decisions they've made, often through no fault of their own. It just, life happens.
Okay, this is up for grabs. What are some of the biggest challenges to land sharing and what can be done to overcome these challenges? Ownership models, finance, planning or building regulations. So what are some of the biggest challenges to making land sharing a reality through sort of finances? Jane?
Getting a group of people with the same values that can all go on a mortgage that can all apply for a mortgage. And then you'd want to set it up, if I was talking to you about it, I'd be talking about setting up a trust structure and setting up all your exit strategies before you borrow any money, so that everyone knows where they stand, everyone knows what their options are. So you hope for the best, but prepare for the worst from the get-go.
Hey Jane, should you do this with your best friend?
That could be problematic as well, because your best friend you may not want to live next door to. And what happens if you have a disagreement with your best friend and you're stuck next door to them? It could be a little bit too much of a good thing. I don't know. That's just my opinion.
Can I ask you about this trust model, and how does that develop into the future as the value of the property would increase and someone kind of wants out and someone else comes in?
I know what, in my daughter's situation, what happens is that you get two valuations. You take the average of the valuations. That's how they work that out. But with a trust situation, you'd have to work out the ownership, and you'd probably want to have a corporate trustee, and then you could just sell the shares to someone else. You could sell your shares in the enterprise to the next person who wants to come in.
Yeah, various models. Someone has mentioned that the Cascade co-housing that appeared to sell sort of at market value recently. And then there was the Nightingale one I mentioned earlier, where they worked out that exit strategy, which was the original cost-only price plus the percentage gain, which was the average for that suburb. So there are various strategies. But on that note, because it can, Jane, when we spoke, thinks there are ways of lessening the likelihood, apart from changing circumstances, of needing an exit strategy, and that is if you set up things really well in the first place with shared expectations and understandings.
I think these are kind of really practical things. The challenges, I think in the beginning, if you're going in, like there's a huge amount of work that has to be done to make something work before it's actually a thing. And I think one of the things that is good to make sure that everyone involved has their own job. You can't all try and be doing all of the stuff. So if one person's better with money, they can be in charge of the financial bits. If someone's better with the design part of it, get them to do that, because I think before you even start designing anything, getting any approvals, there's a lot of it, you need to have robust agreements around how you're going to work as a team, because you're almost creating your own little company in a way. So another as well as having financial advice, I would also suggest legal advice to draw up the agreement of how you're going to work together to get the thing done, and give everyone their own job.
Good. Okay, next question. I think it's an Adam one. How big or many rooms, separate living areas, can a house have by council standards?
As many as you want, really, provided you don't have more than... I think we would start asking questions if you had more than one laundry. It can come down to those facilities, so the kitchen, bathroom and laundry. Obviously you see, it's quite common these days, you see multiple bathrooms in a house. You might even see like a little kitchenette downstairs and a main kitchen. I think certainly if you start having kind of all of those facilities and multiple examples of those facilities, council is going to start asking questions, well, is this still a single dwelling or is it becoming a multiple dwelling?
And where would council tend to see the line between one dwelling with pods and, yeah, when would they start to see that, to frame it another way, as separate dwellings rather than one dwelling of pods?
Yeah, and I suppose this is going back to sort of my daydream idea of what we would do with our family. I mean, there's no guarantee how each individual council would see it. So certainly how I would approach it would be, once we've found the land, the next course of action would be to go to talk to council and actually talk to the planner, which can be a bit difficult to do sometimes at the smaller councils. So there's only limited planning staff at the smaller councils. You might only get to talk to a customer service officer. For this kind of out of the ordinary development, I would be really pushing to make an appointment with the planner. Normally if you can make an appointment, they're happy to meet. Just don't rock up and expect to meet a busy planner. But where that tipping point is in terms of the number of pods, it's grey, to be honest. It probably comes back to what I was saying before about you need, ideally, the decision maker, you're keeping the decision maker happy and comfortable with what you're proposing. So that's probably the answer.
Okay, here's another good question, because this is about dongers. Could you add a demountable portable dwelling to an existing dwelling without any approval? Are there penalties? I know there can be if you don't deal with your dunny stuff.
I guess one thing is that there's two approval processes with any building. There's planning and then there's building approval, and they are completely separate. Sorry. So some things don't need a planning approval, but they do need a building approval. So pretty much anything that's got any plumbing in it, has a structure, will need some sort of building approval, which starts with a building surveyor. And there are various levels of different approvals in the building area that you would need to get. Yeah. So if it has plumbing or structure, it will need a building approval. What do you mean by
Demountable,
a demountable? Yeah, I would need a building approval.
so there'd be penalties if you just...
Yes, I would always recommend trying to retrospectively get something approved is way harder than doing it correctly in the first place. I know.
Not that you've been there, done that. No. Naughty. Okay, can someone please talk on... Oh, whoops. Thought I saw movement.
I recently learned that if you want to build something onto an existing dwelling, what you need is a firewall, which is actually really expensive. So anything that you want to add on to your existing building, that has to be the investment because it's going to be seen as two separate buildings.
Okay, we're getting the wrap up. So thanks from me, lovely audience. Over to our host, Jane.
Thank you so much for coming. I hope you've all learnt something. And look, we've got heaps of questions, a lot of detail here. And look, we will try and get to all of that in the coming weeks. But I really appreciate everyone for coming, and I hope that it sparks lots of conversations and that you've learnt something and you could potentially move forward with something that you've got in mind. And thank you again to Ruth for having us here tonight. It's been a lovely space. Good night.